lecture content from Wednesday and Friday, and I'm just continuing from where we ended in the second video, talking about automatic and selective attention and comparing and contrasting these two types of attention. And so I'm going to take you through the comparison and contrast of these two forms of attention, talk about their implications for instruction, and then I'm going to go back to the IP model, talk about where they are, and move into our discussion of perception. So we're finishing up attention, moving to perception in this video. And so when I think about automatic and selective attention, there's a couple important differences along with some similarities. And so in the last video, we already talked about automatic attention being very brief, so kind of lasting basically as long as the external stimulus that the attention is directed to. That was me clapping to demonstrate automatic attention, whereas selective attention can be more sustained. Because it's internally directed, we decide what we pay attention to, and so we're able to we typically sustain that for longer periods of time. The core difference between automatic and selective attention is how they're triggered. Automatic attention is triggered by an external stimulus. So clapping, lights flashing, loud noise, somebody tapping you, that triggers your automatic attention. So it's something external that grabs your mental focus. Whereas selective attention is internally triggered. I am choosing to pay attention to some external stimulus. And of course, the thing that they have in common, and what's inherent when I say attention, is that in both cases, the attention is still directed toward something external. But the difference is whether that direction toward the external stimulus is triggered by that stimulus itself, for example, clapping, or whether it's internally triggered. So I'm choosing to pay attention. We tend to think of automatic attention as automatic. Which is kind of redundant with its definition. But when I clap, you don't think about, okay, am I going to pay attention to this or not? The way automatic attention works is that it's almost unconscious. You automatically pay attention to it. You don't have like a conscious processing of do I choose to or not. We just automatically tune into it. Whereas selective attention, I have to decide to pay attention. And so in that way, selective attention is considered to be more conscious or more purposeful. Automatic attention requires limited cognitive effort. So we always know attention is effortful. But because automatic attention is automatically triggered without any kind of effort on our part, it just happens. And because it tends to be very brief, we tend to think of automatic attention as requiring less cognitive effort or less cognitive resources. And we'll talk about what those are. But for now, we can just think about it as being easier. Whereas selective attention requires quite a bit of cognitive effort. As we saw in the monkey passing video, it's kind of hard to pay attention. It took some cognitive effort on your part. And of course, whenever we talk about attention, it's typically the effortful, less so for automatic, more so for selective, but it's the directing of cognitive resources. So these are both types of attention. They just differ in whether something is getting my attention or I am choosing to direct my attention to some external stimulus. So whether it's automatic or selective, what are the implications of attention? What do I want to be thinking about as a teacher? And so actually I'm going to go back to the IP model now, just so you can see where we are in thinking about how we as individuals process information. So there's our IP model. And so we talked about sensory memory as taking in a vast amount of information, but not storing it for very long. And so from the vast amount of information that we take in, we choose to pay attention or to direct our resources, or some of that information grabs our attention to some of it. So attention serves as a mental filter. It selects the particular stimuli that we're going to attend to from the volume that are captured in sensory memory. And so as I'm thinking about directing students' attention or directing students to the type of resources, to the type of stimuli I want them to focus on, what are some things to think about as a teacher? And so as I'm flipping through, think about what is a takeaway? What is a classroom takeaway for attention? What is an instructional implication? And I'll just list some here for you guys. So first, I want to limit stimuli. So as a reminder, we can only really pay attention to one stimulus at a time. When we're talking about attention, we're talking about directing our mental resources to one stimuli to the exclusion of other stimuli. And so I want to limit the amount of stimuli that are potentially vying for my students' attention. So for example, if I'm asking students to pay attention to a storybook I'm reading, I want to make sure that there's not anything else going on around me. So people aren't coming in and out of the room, other students aren't walking around different classroom stations. If I have somebody helping me in the classroom, that they're not doing something in the background that's going to draw students' attention away from the stimulus that I need. So I want to limit the amount of stimuli that I'm asking students to pay attention to. And likewise, thinking about automatic attention, I want to limit distractions. And by that, I mean I want to limit anything that can draw my students' selective attention away with automatic attention. So if my students are focusing on reading independently and so they're reading a book, I don't want to have a door slamming or the intercom going off or somebody popping in to say hi or somebody making a lot of noise so that their selective attention is broken up by automatic attention. I want to think about developmentally appropriate attention demands. What that means is we talked about attention as being an effortful process. We don't have a limited amount of an unlimited amount of cognitive effort that we can of cognitive resources that we could dedicate to paying attention. And so I want to think about how long am I asking my students to pay attention? I want to recognize that asking them to pay attention or to sustain a cognitively demanding activity for a long time is effortful for them. So I want to think about how long am I asking them to pay attention? Am I giving them the opportunity for brain breaks? Is the stimulus attractive enough where it's going to be something that they're interested in paying attention to for a sustained period of time? Because remember, sustained attention is individually directed. And so or selective attention rather, is individually directed. And what that means is students have to want to pay attention. They have to want to direct their cognitive resources to that particular stimulus. And so for that reason, I want to think about what is it that I'm asking them to direct their attention toward. So for example, using something like brain breaks or kind of get up for 30 seconds and stretch it out to give students a break from focusing their cognitive effort could be really effective in the classroom. I want to direct their attention to important information, and I think this goes hand in hand with limiting stimuli. So a lot of times, even in this class, there's a lot going on, right? So I'm presenting these slides to you, so some of your attention should be going toward me talking, some of your attention should be going to the words flashing up on the slides. You also have structured notes that you're taking, so some of your attention is going toward what's on that worksheet. And so I want to be, as a teacher, very purposeful about where I'm directing my students' attention and saying, okay, right now I need you to look up here because I'm going to demonstrate something for you. Okay, now I want you to focus on your notes as you're listening to me talk and writing down the important information. So especially for younger students, helping students to direct their attention to the stimuli you really care about is going to be really important for helping them to filter out information. So again, thinking about attention as a mental filter. And that brings us to kind of the last question of, can we multitask? And so we've been talking about, I'm going to cough. Excuse me. We've been talking about attention as directing toward an external stimulus. But for example, when I'm driving, I'm sometimes paying attention to lots of external stimuli. So I'm paying attention to obviously the road conditions, but also if my phone flashes, I kind of look over a bit and maybe I am putting on my makeup or I'm doing my hair and I'm listening to the radio and thinking about what NPR is saying, and that's a lot of stimuli. So what's happening to my attention? And so my question for you is, can we multitask? And so turn to your neighbor and just for 10 seconds, give them a yes or no and why. Sorry for that coughing break. So the answer is that we cannot pay attention to multiple stimuli. As you saw in the monkey video, if I'm really paying attention to the players in white shirts passing the ball, that means that I'm not paying attention to the color of the curtain or the black player leaving the team or maybe the gorilla, right? The way attention works is that it's only directed to a single stimulus. And so what happens when we multitask? Well, the answer is we're not really multitasking. We're not really doing multiple tasks at the same time. There's no way to split attention. What we're doing is we're attention switching. We're rapidly switching between stimuli. So when I'm looking at the road, my attention is on the road. When I'm looking at the phone, my attention is on my phone. When I'm looking at myself in kind of the rearview mirror to check my makeup, my attention is on the mirror. And so what I'm doing is I'm very quickly switching between stimuli. And as you may expect, what that means is the quality of my performing any one task is very much reduced, right? So think about if you went while you were watching the basketball passes, you switched over to looking at the black players. You would miss what the white players were doing in terms of passing the basketball, right? So what that means is when we do these kinds of attention switching, and this is true for everybody. There was once an NPR story that was like, some percent of people think that they're multitaskers, but they're all wrong. And the people who are especially confident are especially bad at multitasking. And it's kind of like that. We have the illusion of multitasking. We have the illusion of being able to pay attention to multiple stimuli at the same time. But the truth of the matter is that none of us can really multitask. What we're doing is attention switching, and that leads to serious compromises in our performance. And so it's hard enough when, for example, right now you're doing attention switching. So you're moving from focusing on the slides to focusing on your notes. And if you've ever been in class, if you were really focused on writing down your notes, sometimes you miss what the professor is saying. But task switching when we're still talking about the same content, so I'm talking, that corresponds to the words that are flashing on your screen, it corresponds to the notes you're taking. That kind of task switching is a lot easier than if I'm switching between really different tasks. So driving versus reading my phone, right? And so we want to be very careful about task switching, and we want to help students to pay attention to one thing at a time. And that goes hand in hand with limiting stimuli. So there really is no multitasking. We want to teach students how to pay attention for sustained periods of time. And the last thing I want to say, this goes hand in hand with the developmentally appropriate attentional demands, is that attentional capacity, just like many things, can be developed. So particularly in younger grades, you'll see really large differences in students' attention span. So some students will be able to sit on the carpet like little angels and hear you read a story for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And some students really won't. And actually for younger students, you tend to see a lot more variability in attention span. And so, but if I teach students how to pay attention for longer and longer periods of time, how to focus and distract resources, and the way that that happens is just by giving them practice with it. So saying, okay, there's a clock up here. I'm going to ask you to do this activity for 5 minutes or 7 minutes, or then all the way up to 10 minutes. You can develop students' attentional capacity. And that's absolutely something that we want to be doing as teachers, while acknowledging that developmentally students may have more limited attention when they're younger. And so that kind of concludes our discussion of attention for now and leads us into perception. So where we are in IP theory is we have a ton of information bombarded on us in our sensory memory. We pay attention to some of those stimuli. And perception, which is the next process that we're going to talk about, is how we move information to working memory and how we start to really process information. So when we're talking about sensory memory, when we're talking about attention, we're not processing any information yet. We're taking in information and we're directing our attention to it. And perception is when processing just starts to happen. And I think of perception as really having two components. When I talk about perception, there's sensation and there's recognition. So sensation is the sensory memory part. It's the taking of information in. It's the physical and psychological experience of taking an environmental stimulus. So when I see something, when I hear something, I sense it. That's just the perception piece. But the second part of, that's just the sensation piece, the taking it in. But the second part of perception within educational psychology is recognition. So in order to perceive a stimulus, I have to both take it in and recognize it. I have to sense it and label it. So for example, if I smell something and it's an unfamiliar smell, if I just smell something, that's sensation. But if I smell something and say, that's chocolate chip cookies, that's the recognition piece. And then we can say I have perceived the smell of chocolate chip cookies. Or when you saw the monkey video, you saw the images in front of you and you said, oh, okay, this is going to be a video. You recognize the stimulus. And when we're talking about perception, we're talking about sensation and recognition. And so where we are in terms of our IP model, I want to go back, even though it's pretty annoying to flip through these slides. I want to show you guys where we are in this model. Okay, so where we are is we take a ton of information into our sensory memory. We tune in to some of that information. We direct our cognitive resources to it through the process of attention. And once I've directed my attention toward a stimulus, I label it. I perceive it. I say, oh, okay, I know what that is. That's chocolate chip cookies. Or that's, if we're talking about an iconic stimulus, I say, oh, that's my mom's face. So I label it. I see it. I attend to it. And so sensation, attention, and then I perceive it. I label it. In this case, saying, okay, that's my mom's face, or that's a YouTube video. And so when we talk about perception, that recognition part is a meaning-making process. It's the idea that we are putting a label to the particular sensation or the particular physical stimulus. And so we're going to talk about some principles of perception. And perception actually was one of the earliest phenomenons to be studied. So if you remember from the first day, I talked to you about Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory and how he was the first psychologist, and he was really interested in things like discrimination between stimuli. So how quickly can I say, oh, that's a green, white flashing, that's a red light flashing? That's a perception question, right? It's labeling stimuli. It's the recognition of particular sensations. And so what I'm going to do on the next few slides is I'm going to show you some stimuli, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what you see, what you perceive, the meaning making that you get from that stimulus. And then we'll come back together and we'll talk about what we can deduce about how human perception works. Okay. So I'm going to ask you what you see here. And so this tends to show up a little bit small, so I'm not sure if you see it, but probably some of you saw a dog, a Dalmatian. So its head is over here, and its feet are over here, and it's kind of in a park with a tree. And so what's interesting is that you tried to see something. You tried to see a picture here. You tried to see a dog, whereas you didn't say, oh, it's just kind of a random collection of blobs. Let's try another one. So if you looked over here, you probably said, oh, I see a box, or I see a cube. And over here, you probably said, oh, I see a vase, but I also see two faces. Which is interesting because there's no three-dimensionality here, right? This is 2D, right? These are just flat images. But why is it that we see a three-dimensional cube here? Or why is it that we see a vase here, even though it's kind of a flat object? What do you see here? So a lot of you probably said that you see a triangle with kind of balls on the end. And here you see, this looks like a dog toy to me, but here you see kind of the koosh ball with the spikes on the end. And here you see some kind of snake. But I don't understand why that would be the case, because there's no triangles here. Triangles have three sides. So how is it possible that you see a triangle here where there's no straight lines here? And likewise, there's no ball, there's no circle here. Why do you perceive this as a ball? And so already you can see that we see things, we make sense of things differently than the way they literally appear on the page. So you're putting lines into this triangle. Because of the way these black balls are structured, you're seeing a triangle there. Let's try another one. So you probably see joystick kind of objects here, and you probably see 4 of them. And you probably perceive them as all the same thing, which is really interesting because in fact, these are 4 completely different objects, right? So this one is tilted to the side and has a ball on top. This one seems to be, you can't even see the full circle. So really these objects look very different. This one has a dotted line, whereas these ones have straight lines. And so that's really interesting. So we seem to be perceiving the same thing even though it looks very different. What do you see here? You probably said that you saw a circle and a triangle and a rectangle. But how could that be? Circles are continuous, whereas here we have broken lines, but you're perceiving it as a continuous object. Let's do another one. Here you probably said the letter S or the letter 5. And here you probably said, well, 2 parallel black lines. But why do we perceive the S, why do we perceive these circles all together as an S and a 5, as opposed to saying I see a row of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 circles and 8 circles and 8 circles and 8 circles? Why do you put the black dots together? Why do you perceive them together when they're really part of a larger row? That's interesting. What do you see here? You probably are thinking something like clusters of different shapes, but why do you put these shapes together versus these shapes? They're all kind of on the same page. But interestingly, you perceive these as distinct groups of objects. Let's do one more. So I wish I could block out these bottom ones, but just focus on the top figure right now. And if I asked you to describe this, you would probably say that you see a squiggly line with a dash through it, which is really interesting. So you probably see it like this, squiggly line dash through it. And you don't see it as, if I were to just slice this in half, as kind of a line with a bump on top and then two arches with a line connecting them. So why do we see it as this, as the image on the left, as opposed to the image on the right? Because we want to see this squiggly line as somehow continuous and then segmented by the horizontal bar. So already you guys are seeing some interesting patterns in our perception that's a little bit different than the information that's literally on the page. I'm going to stop the video here, and on the next video, I'm going to show you some more stimuli. We'll talk about perception in general and what we can conclude from it.